Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Greetings to everyone around the world. Welcome to Fair Observer Exclusive. This is our monthly event where we recap the three most important issues of the last 30 days or so. Today, Glenn Carle is not with me. He has a medical appointment. Today, instead, I have another American, a younger version of Glenn Carle, who's actually lived in Russia for a while. Instead of Glenn, he is not serving the CIA, at least not that we know of. He is a corporate lawyer in Asia currently, and is a high-flying one, I'm told. And he speaks Russian, knows Russia, knows Asia as well, and is the perfect man to make sense of this month. Welcome to Joseph Wolpin for filling in for Glenn Carle. Joe, great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Atul. Very, very good to be here.
Brilliant. So our top three choices for March, the month of March, are war in Ukraine, obviously, economic implications of the war in Ukraine, which are less obvious, and the geopolitical implications of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to put it more precisely. Now, without further ado, I'm going to speak very briefly about the war in Ukraine. All of you are probably saturated with headlines. There are claims, of course, in the BBC and in American media that this war has gone terribly for Russia. Russia has failed to achieve its strategic goals. Russia has underestimated the resistance in Ukraine, and Russian tanks have been destroyed by both British and American missiles given to the Ukrainians. Now, all of that may be true and probably is true, but it is not entirely true in our estimation. The war has certainly not gone according to plan for Russia. Russia has made many errors. They have encountered fierce resistance, but on the whole, it seems that it hasn't gone too badly as well for Russia. At least they have the coast. They may have Mariupol very shortly. They've razed it to the ground. And if nothing else, they have smashed Ukraine's economy and ensured that Ukraine now will not be any kind of potential rival slash alternative to the Russian model, to the Vladimir Putin model. And Russia is fairly well ensconced in terms of at least having the territory it wants and destroying a potential, or if not destroying, weakening a potential rival in the near neighborhood. I'll leave it to Joe to carry on. He's obviously someone who's lived in Russia, speaks Russian, and has a wealth of knowledge on the subject. Joe, over to you.
No, thank you, Atul. No, that's a good introduction, and I think largely reflects sort of my thoughts as well. It's easy to say now because we're sort of I remember you and I chatted a few weeks back, and I told you I'm not sure where we're at now. Are we at the beginning of the end, or are we sort of, to quote Churchill, the Second Battle of El Alamein, are we at the end of the beginning here? I think we're at one of the two. And in that hindsight, I think it may be a little easier to say, but I do feel in retrospect a little proud to have thought that. I think when we look back on this and we look at what Russia was trying to achieve and what their goals are now, I think you're right that it's a little I think too quick to conclude that Russia's campaign here, or that their goals weren't met or aren't being met. I was sort of am in the camp of those who thought from the beginning that Russia's goal in this entire sort of endeavor was not to take Ukraine or much less hold Ukraine, not to try to conquer Kiev or conquer the western parts of the country, which I think they always knew would be an incredibly difficult and bloody and years-long sort of task. I think their goals always were from the outset to obtain certain assurances from NATO and Ukraine in respect of Ukraine's involvement and association or membership with Ukraine. And very importantly, to gain legal sort of recognition, de jure status of Crimea, Lugansk, and Donetsk. And in recent weeks, the Russian negotiators have said as much. And that seems to be the direction of travel, talking about sort of these key elements being the sort of ingredients of a peace going forward. I do think that Russia was looking to test Ukraine, to test the resolve of the government, the popularity of the government, the stability of the government, to test the resolve of the West, to try their luck to a certain extent. So when I say that they were looking to take Crimea, looking to get formal recognition for Crimea, which I think we would all agree as a de facto matter has been under Russian control since 2014, 2013. I think in addition to that, though, they were trying to try their luck, so to speak, and see what other parts of southern Ukraine could they potentially take with a military operation. And I do think we're seeing really the brutality and the aggressiveness with which they are attacking Mariupol. I think I'm assuming there was a strand of thought within the Russian sort of elite to say, well, perhaps we can take so much of Ukraine that we can landlock the country. We can completely monopolize the access to the Black Sea, which is a very long historical ambition of Russia that goes back centuries. I don't know that they thought that was a foregone conclusion that they could do that, but I do think that was a possibility in their mind. But in any event, I think when we look at the situation now, we look at the rhetoric coming out of the Russians and the negotiating teams in the Kremlin and Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary. I think we do see that the key elements seem to be a recognition of Crimea, Lugansk, Donetsk, and some assurances around NATO. But I think there's more than that. I think the one thing that they won't say, and part of the reason that even though I think we're starting to see the direction of travel, we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, one reason we're not at the finish line yet is because, in my view, Russia is still trying to punish Ukraine, and they are still trying to create a situation where they bomb and terrorize and destroy the country to such a degree that they create a future for themselves where Ukraine will spend the next 2 to 3 to 4+ years in a phase of reconstruction. And that reconstruction will involve not just time, but billions of dollars. Millions of Ukrainians have fled the country, not all of whom will come back. There will be a degree of brain drain that affects the country from people talk about the brain drain of Russia and that there are people who are fearful of the way the government's going. And I think that's a real phenomenon, but there will be a brain drain. There will be an exodus out of Ukraine because of this. And I think part of Russia's goal here is to ensure that the Ukraine that remains, whatever shape that is a country that is in no shape, putting aside the legal and the diplomatic and the geopolitical considerations and discussions. They want to leave a country that is in no shape equipped to join NATO or join the EU, or even more broadly, integrate more closely with the West. And so I think you will see in the next, I think to achieve that requires a relatively long-standing military operation, a brutal operation, one where they destroy civilian infrastructure, they destroy the military as much as they can, and they make this a costly war. So in my view, where we are now, we are seeing, I do think we see the contours of the end of this crisis, but I also think this won't be something that's over in the next days or even possibly week or two, because I think Russia still wants to inflict a price and make a damage onto the country that will last for years. So that's where I think we're at this point, and it remains to be seen. We're seeing all of these sort of innuendo and nuances with poisonings of Abramovich as part of the negotiating team, which I don't think anyone appreciated. We're seeing all these sort of, every day you sort of turn on the news, the story seems to take a left or a right in a direction that you weren't expecting. But broadly speaking, I think those are the broad brush strokes in terms of where I think we are and where we're going.
Joe, a quick question. you think they'll take Mariupol in a matter of weeks, if not days?
Well, right before I joined this call, I saw what I think was BBC footage of the coastline of Mariupol, and the city looks razed in parts. It looks decimated, and so I would have thought that yes, that they are probably imminently in a position to take the city. I think the question becomes, to what extent do they really want to hold territory that they think would be hostile to them long term? That is part of the reason why I didn't think, at least in my view, from the beginning, this operation was about holding cities like Kiev, much less Western Ukraine, because I think the Russians, I think we have to fight against an inclination to underestimate the Russians. So I think, as you started out in your introduction by saying, there is a narrative going on now that the Russians miscalculated entirely, that they underestimated the resistance, they underestimated the difficulty with which it would that they would encounter in trying to take the country. You know, Russia, putting aside this very, very deep and difficult question around who is advising Putin, how much of a vacuum is he operating in, Russia and he are longstanding, very sophisticated players, for lack of a better term. And I think ultimately we're still doing that Soviet style reading the tea leaves around who knows what and who is thinking what. But I think it's very dangerous to underestimate and to assume that the Russians have made a grave error. I think the Russians and Putin probably could not have predicted, and neither did I, and I suspect neither did many, the outrage with which the West and the world reacted to all of this. The corporate response, the public response has been, I think, extremely aggressive and extremely vocal. I don't think people necessarily anticipated that. But I do think that the Russians were not looking to conquer a country that they knew they couldn't hold easily. I don't think that was in the cards. I don't personally believe the narrative that Putin thought the country would simply fall, the government would collapse, and the Ukrainians would welcome him with open arms. If that's true, then there is truly a degree of delusion going on. I at least am giving more credit to the elite and the power players in Russia and assuming that that's not what they thought. But going back to your question, I think Mariupol has taken the brunt of an extremely aggressive assault. And I suspect Russian control could be taken of that city quite soon. I think the real question is, was the point of that assault to punish, or was it actually to take the territory? And that I think is a gray area that I think is difficult to know.
So in your estimation, then we do not expect a push towards Odessa?
A few weeks ago, when I saw that there was so I think when and I'm certainly no military expert, I'm a mere attorney, but when I saw the reports of how the Russian forces seemed to be operating, I think it was quite clear that from the south, from the Black Sea, there was immense pressure from the beginning. So and I think the reports were suggesting that the more elite Russian fighters were also coming in from the south, the Marine type, sort of naval type forces of Russia. The bombardment was being really targeted from the south. There was a moment where, as I said earlier, I asked myself, is the real goal here to landlock Ukraine? Because in some ways that would be a coup. In many ways, as I mentioned, that would fulfill this sort of almost ancient at this point Russian goal of access to the Black Sea. You can go back to Peter the Great and go from the 18th century sort of on to know about the Russian ambitions around Black Sea access, but to fully occupy essentially the sort of northern parts of the Black Sea, I suspect would be the fulfillment of a centuries-old ambition for Russia. But also to landlock Ukraine, again, going back to this element of punishing the country and inflicting a real damage on whatever country survives this conflict. Landlocking the country would certainly do that. It would deprive Ukraine of a significant military strategic geographic area, it would deprive them of a very key commercial access point. And so I do think that that was probably considered, potentially still being considered by Russia. But in my estimation, I think the Russians understand that the world, broadly speaking, has reacted quite strongly to what's going on in Ukraine. The level of sanctions has been quite significant against Russia. I think they're starting to, they're feeling the effects of those. I think Russian popular opinion potentially is being pressured towards an inflection point. And in that context, my guess is that Russia is looking at the end post here. They're looking at the finish line, and that probably doesn't mean making an assault on a city like Odessa, where they would encounter significant resistance. Again, that's not to say that they won't bombard them. To be honest, I wouldn't be shocked if they started to bombard Lviv in a greater way. If, again, only to make the point of, we're able to do this militarily, only to make the point of, we are going to inflict this cost on you, Ukraine. But I do not think at this point that they will be trying to hold and invade cities. And I think that extends to a city like Odessa on the Black Sea, but really not one that is inclined to just sort of roll over and declare themselves a part of Russia, at Russia's whim.
Well, we've come to the end of our first section. If you have questions, please shoot. We'll take them. This is a suggestion by Colonel Jars de Jong that we shouldn't have questions at the end. He's a dear friend. He's a Dutch naval attaché. So we'll take questions now about this aspect. And at the end of the other two sections, we'll take questions too. So please, ladies and gentlemen, shoot. All right. No questions yet, but we certainly have some input from someone who's attending, and he says that the Russians are going to counter the West in secondary theaters. Syria is a very good example, and of course, Russian mercenary penetration in Syria, Libya, and various sub-Saharan African countries is pretty high. And outside of potential kinetic activity, there are, of course, information operations that are focused on Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. In of course, Iraq and Syria, they are in full flight. And Russians historically have been good at information operations. Propaganda, after all, was a key pillar of the Cold War. So we are going to see a fair bit of that. I think, as far as the war is concerned, it seems there'll be the military conflict in Ukraine. There'll be secondary activity across the Middle East, North Africa, and of course, then we can expect a fair degree of information wars, and there'll be narratives spun from different parties, different concerned parties. Peter Isaacson says that the Russia, he quotes Scott Ritter in saying that Russia, Russia's restrained but demonstrative use of thermobarbaric bombs and hypersonic missiles is meant to frighten NATO and demonstrate their ability to do much worse damage if required. I tend to agree, Joe. Would you agree with Scott?
Yeah. So on these 2 points, I agree with both. I think it's very important for the West to not believe that even if we take the view that Russia has miscalculated, this has not gone ultimately the way that Russia wants, to believe that Russia will, even if they conclude a peace with Ukraine here, to believe that they will walk off stage right and then be quiet, I think is naive. I think the point around Russia reacting to all of this, and I mean at a governmental level, we could put aside the societal reactions, which I think is a very interesting topic. I think the Russian government will lick their wounds for quite some time over this, and I think that does involve, as was mentioned, looking at options in Syria in terms of proxy abilities to extend conflict there. Cyber warfare, again, for lack of a better term, I think is exactly right. Russia's not, and Putin, I think, as an individual, as a center of power, this is not the counterparty that will take a defeat or even a perception of defeat lightly. And so I think it's a very, very astute point to recognize that whatever happens in the next month with Ukraine, this is only the beginning of, I think, unfortunately, a broader conflict here between the West and Russia. In terms of whether Russia held back or was Russia trying to make demonstrative threats, I think the latter is certainly true. Russia was I think Russia's bombardment and really the barbarity with which they attacked cities and civilian targets, I think in large part was coming from a desire from them to show that what they could do. Again, I mentioned the press secretary, he was on, Dmitry Peskov was on CNN in the US, and was asked repeatedly whether Russia would definitively rule out nuclear weapons. And they go back to their sort of nuclear policy, which is almost sort of lawyerly-like written, and sort of say, well, in the event of a sort of existential threat and this and that, we have, but the point is that they are, I think, demonstrably sort of trying to say, no, it's on the table, and we're Russian, we can do what we want, including that. And so I do think part of this entire campaign is about showing the world that Russia doesn't back down, that Russia is prepared to do things that perhaps the West isn't. And I think they're doing that intentionally, quite clearly. The real question is, where is their line? And if you hear Ukrainian rhetoric, Zelensky and others sort of saying, well, stand up to Russia. Are you afraid of Russia? Don't you understand after decades, you go back to George Kennan and containment, it's about standing up to them and then they back down. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. But again, who wants to call that Russian bluff in a moment like this? I think that's where it gets very difficult for policymakers. But no, I think it's exactly right that Russia, I think, has shown restraint. I personally am, again, in the camp that says, I think Russia intentionally didn't sort of go all out in some of these assaults. As barbaric and terrible and as targeted towards civilians as they were, in some cases, I don't think Russia did as much as they could. And again, I think that was intentional. I think there was this balance between restraint and intentional, almost barbarism with an intent to frighten.
Excellent. Now we move on to the economic implications of this war. And those of you who live in the Middle East or in South Asia, or any part of the world that imports energy, which includes China, can feel immediately the effect of rising oil and gas prices. Energy is suddenly very expensive and is bound to be more expensive in the coming days. I just flew back from California, and I believe oil, gas as the Americans call it, petrol as the rest of the world calls it, was over $7 a gallon. Now, this means that inflation is going to rip through the economy. Already interest rates are rising. There's something else which people haven't factored in, particularly if they are food sufficient. But if they are not, as Lebanon isn't, as Egypt and Libya are not, Tunisia as well. And many of these countries depend on imports of wheat from Ukraine and Russia, which comes down from the Black Sea. Well, what this means is that you could have the specter of internal discontent. You could have the specter of revolts, even revolutions. You could have an Arab Spring 2.0, because disorder in most countries, including France, as we know from 1789, is directly correlated. We can't certainly say it's causation alone, but it's certainly correlated with the price of bread. And the price of bread is going to shoot up, is shooting up. Along with that, fertilizers are going to be scarce because they are made basically from gas. And Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia have been key suppliers. Sunflower oil will be short. a number of other commodities are facing shortages too. So this is a time where all the countries relying on Russian imports, and there are quite a few in this extremely globalized world we live in, are feeling the pinch. So the economic implications of this are inflation, perhaps food scarcity, if not famine, are internal disorder, which is not exactly economics, and the long-term implications of this are likely to be what people are calling globalization. Since 1991, we had a period of extreme globalization, and especially when it came to movement of goods and then services, and then of course capital, of course. And capital just went around the world chasing the highest returns. Now there will be a shortening of supply chains and a reshoring of jobs. COVID already put pressure on that when people found that they needed equipment and they needed stuff to be closer, supply chains were stretched. Now that pressure will increase. This again will add to the upward pressure on inflation. Military spending is going to increase. The peace dividend is over, particularly in Western Europe. Germany and other countries will spend more on the military. This means higher taxes and a bigger state. We might be going back to more Keynesian policies. If so, then there will be two things that'll follow. One, there'll be a pressure on the welfare state, and B, ultimately, there will be pressure to raise taxes. You cannot increase funding forever, especially when inflation is running high, if you do not raise your income and lower your expenditure. So that is going to change the nature of the economy. In the long run, perhaps spending on defense might lead to advancements. Let's remember that it was Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, that came up with the ARPANET, which became the internet. In the long run, it may all be jolly good, but in the short run, growth rates are going to tank, stock market bubbles might go, and so on and so forth. Third big change would be investment in energy. So far, we've had this fixation with clean energy, which is much needed given you have the specter of climate change, but perhaps the geopolitical factors were not accounted for. So there will be spending. My estimation is there will be more spending both on fossil fuels and alternatives. And Germany is already saying no to, or has suspended Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline that would have brought gas from Russia. Now, of course, they'll be shipping gas from Canada and the US. This will be good for the Canadians and the Americans. Not so good for the Russians and the Germans. They'll pay a higher price. So their competitiveness will be hurt. And as people try to make or to navigate a world of globalization, they'll focus more on energy security, food security, as well as defense security. And so we are going to see a change in the economic model. The post-Cold War era, as many people are saying, is over. I'm inclined to believe that. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, well, if you think about everything that you just said, if taking a step back, what's caused all of this? Well, what's caused all these economic implications and volatility are the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. And in some ways, we've actually embarked on a grand experiment in terms of the application of sanctions on a really broad-based scale. So if you think about, for many, many years, when we think about the application of sanctions by the US or the EU on a country like North Korea or Iran, you often hear there's academic complaints, there's political complaints saying these are not particularly effective. They don't actually achieve the desired goal because they're not able to move a political will in a particular way. But But those have been ultimately, when you think about it, relatively isolated countries that are not as integrated in the global economy as, of course, Russia. And so now, for the first time, we have the West has heavily sanctioned a country that really is fully integrated into the global economy. And that has then led to this Pandora's box opening, I think, again, for lack of a better term, because I don't think, they call economics the dismal science, and I think that I have nothing against economists, but I think, part of that is it's very hard to predict how these things unravel from an economic perspective because it's not scientific. And I think when we decided to do this, when we decided to sanction Russian banks, when we decided to cut certain banks off of the SWIFT system, when we decided to enlarge the pool of SDN, OFAC, specially designated individuals to such a broad profile that the tentacles of that then start to just reach into all sorts of different industries and parts of society. No one really knew, and no one really knows how that ends up. And everything you just described, from the implications on food security, to effects on emerging markets, to effects on actually institutional investors at a large scale. It's actually very difficult to predict. Oil prices. In my line of work, which is around, I'm a capital markets lawyer, and so I help really big companies and international investment banks kind of take companies through IPOs and bond markets. I mean, those markets have really frozen, and that's globally because of the situation, the volatility. Russia, just like they were in 2014, is a toxic market. And it doesn't matter if you're sanctioned or have any nexus whatsoever with the sanctioned entity. Russia is toxic for now. And I read a story a few days ago saying that I think one of the big New York pension funds, out of policy and in part of this corporate wave of disengaging and disassociating with Russia, wants to divest hundreds of millions of dollars of Russian securities. The Russian government kind of cleverly has stopped foreigners from doing that, so they're stuck. But the point is that a country like Russia, we haven't comprehensively sanctioned Russia like we have North Korea or Cuba or Iran historically, but we're getting close. And I think when you do that to a country that is more or less fully integrated in the world economy like Russia is, you can't predict what the far-reaching effects are for 1 month down the road, 6 months down the road, 1 year, 5 years. And so I think it's very difficult to project this and understand, in what direction will this go. I think one thing we can say, though, is that the impact on the Russian society will be very significant. And I think we're already seeing projections of GDP going negative in probably double digits, inflation again in sort of double digits. Yeah. But I also think you're seeing, just more generally, society in Russia reacting to all of this and seeing store after store, company after company leaving the market, seeing that the value of their ruble sort of plummet. And also recognizing, by the way, and I think this is an interesting fact, who stands to gain in Russia right now? In other words, whose money is worth a lot in Russia? Well, it's people who are living in Russia who have access to hard currency. So in other words, if you are dollar rich and you're living in Russia, i.e., if you have access to oil prices and oil assets, then those assets, that money has now translated into massive buying power within the country. And so you're seeing, in some ways, oddly, the sanctions resulting in the middle class and the lower class in Russia taking an enormous hit, while at the same time, at least those who are not sanctioned, but those who have money in Russia, their buying power and their wealth within Russia just flourishing. And so there's a lot of talk around, will this ultimately lead to some sort of economic instability that then could lead to political change in Russia? And I personally don't think that that's particularly likely, and I think that gets into questions of state control over media and Russian culture and the longevity of Putin. But I do think if we can't predict the long-term effects of the impact of these sanctions on the West and all of the ways in which this chain will kind of echo out into society, I think we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that Russia will bear a very significant brunt of impact here. And I don't necessarily think that that's a positive long-term in terms of, I worry that this will play into narratives and fears that the West and the US and Europe were always out to get Russia. And this goes from the Soviet period to the West's machinations during the early 90s and the privatization processes to here is the latest manifestation, see what they've done. And I think when you're dealing with a society where information is controlled quite closely and you're dealing with a society whose cultural and historical antecedents are very insular, I think you have to worry about a situation where an economy tanks. And although Putin is older and his reign of power, regardless, has a time sort of limit, I don't think it's fair to assume that what comes after Putin will be more progressive or more democratic than he. So that's my worry. I will have to leave it to the economists to pontificate and try to assess what the international impact on all of this is. I told you from my perspective, I am seeing it in real time in my limited world of institutional investment, which is frozen. But the long-term implications on the West, I think, are unclear. The long-term implications on Russia, I think, are quite dismal. Yeah,
but the long-term implications are only starting to play out. Peter Isaacson has just talked about de-dollarization, and that might begin because SWIFT action on SWIFT, pardon the pun, certainly unraveled the faith or unraveled the fabric of trade and finance around the world, because China, even India, saw this as weaponization of business and economics, and we are now seeing talk of a petro-yuan trade. We are also seeing talk of Russia offering oil at a deep discount to India, to China. Remember, India cannot afford oil at $100 a barrel. India is still a relatively poor country with pretty low per capita income. So the economic implications of this conflict are only beginning to play out. And I think the West is not going to face the brunt of it. It'll be the likes of Sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps, or certainly the Middle East and North Africa, and even the likes of India and China who are going to pay the price for it. Because let's say Egypt, 70 to 80% by some estimates of their wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. What's going to happen to that wheat? How does Egypt, with its unemployment, with its perilous economy, feed its masses? Recently, India sent 50,000 tons of wheat to Afghanistan. The US did not. It was India that did so. India did it basically to buy peace in its near abroad. And that is the sort of spiral we are getting into. With food, with energy prices, with globalization. And I personally feel that for so long, the central banks have practiced quantitative easing. They've printed money as if there's no tomorrow. And now there's a supply side shock. So you had A, quantitative easing, B, COVID, and then C, this Russian aggression in Ukraine. And so I personally think that the global economy is probably going to crater. It may be a recession, but it could even be a depression. Now, I don't want to sound like a doomsdayer, but I certainly believe that the supply side is huge. And it's not just the supply side shock that is huge. It is also the fact that there is very little faith amongst various actors in the global economy. The West, of course, is very united, but someone asked in a question, and this brings us very nicely onto the last section. Someone asked a question about why only North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others have joined in the sanctions. And the reason is very simple. A lot of the countries outside this circle feel that America has committed aggression in the past, and America went willy-nilly into Iraq. And what is the point of them getting involved in a fight between the big boys, between the elephants? They refer to the African proverb that when two elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And they see themselves as grass. They don't see the West fundamentally. And this is where I think the West does not understand its colonial legacy. They do not see the West as just a part of the world that stands up for democracy and human rights. Still in a place like Kenya or South Africa or Nigeria or Malaysia or India, any former colony, there are large sections of the population, especially the intelligentsia, that believe that the West is neo-colonial, and they suspect the West as much as perhaps they suspect Russia. So that's why they don't want to get involved in a fight. And they also believe that this outrage on Ukraine and the welcoming of Ukrainian refugees is at odds with the lack of care for Afghanistan. I have talked to a number of Indian officials who say, hang on a minute, America just withdrew from Afghanistan and left the problem at our doorstep, and we are the one giving wheat. And there has been no help or appreciation for what we did over the last 20 years with America and for America. And now they want us to jump into a fight that is theirs, not ours. All we want is wheat, and we are going to pay the price in inflation. And besides, about 60, 70, whatever the percentage is, it's hard to tell, of our defense supplies come from Russia. So we don't want the war. We want the war to end, but we are not going to get involved with either side. So there are lots of things in play, which brings us very nicely on, very, very nicely on to the geopolitical implications of the war in Ukraine. And the geopolitical implications, first and foremost, of course, what happens to NATO after this, because it's a war in Europe. And as of now, of course, there has been a strengthening of alliances. There has been an increase in defense spending, or at least murmurs to that effect. Germany has offered military aid to Ukraine, so there seems to be a strengthening. But France seems to be playing a different role, as France always does. France seems to be playing the role of a peacemaker, mediator. And so it'll be interesting to see how Europe unfolds after this. Will Europe unite under NATO, under US leadership in NATO, or will there be talk for a European alternative European security apparatus, security model, which Anna Pirnia has talked about, a new security model in the Q&A. And then we look at China. China, of course, has to deal with COVID-19, which is spreading through the country. It has to deal with a slowing economy, which is a major concern. And now it has Russia, and it has to navigate both its interests with Russia vis-a-vis the West, because after all, it exports. It is the workshop of the world, and it exports to the West. And yet, its energy is likely in the long term, especially given the giant pipeline being built, is likely to come from Russia. And it does not want to be in the same position as Russia, to be squashed by the West. After all, China has numerous conflicts with its neighbors, which don't even need to, we don't need to go into this time, because this is more an analysis of the broad brush geopolitical implications rather than a China-specific analysis. But they have problems with Taiwan, with Vietnam, with Japan, with South Korea, and so on and so forth. So the Chinese fear they could be squashed like the Russians in the future. So they are trying to walk the tightrope. I already mentioned India. India is trying to walk the tightrope too. India has no intention of getting involved with either party, even though it is in favor of the end of the war. It is in its interests for the war to end. But India does not trust the West at all, particularly the current political dispensation. And it too is trying to walk a tightrope, because it is very reliant on US investment, and indeed It exports immensely to the US, but in terms of its defense ties, in terms of its historic ties, especially given Russian backing over Kashmir, which has been consistent, it is unlikely to go against Russia. So if you go down the geopolitics of it, playing all the way across the Middle East and Africa, it is back to every nation looking at its self-interest. And in my view, the post-war or the post-1991 order of a rules-based economic, political, and normative world order has taken a big hit. I'll stop here. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, the geopolitical implications of this, like the economic ones, are difficult to predict. I was just going to add, before I forget, just one small anecdotal point around the economic side of this, which since we transitioned from that. But here in Thailand, even, where the country has made enormous efforts to open the doors despite COVID, and I think they've given up even PCR tests before you come in. Russia was always a big market of this country. I think in terms of GDP in Thailand, tourism is about 25%, and Russians comprise a big chunk of that. But because of what's going on in Russia, the Russians, despite the openness of Thailand, they've sort of not coming, and the numbers have dropped off. And you actually see Thailand, reacting, of course, economically quite badly to that, because even though they've opened, suddenly, one of their largest country sort of visitor sources has dried up. But also, just in talking with Thais, I think there's a lack of interest and a lack of appreciation around the bigger issues, the geopolitical issues of the situation. Just sort of saying, well, I'm not sure why the world is ganging up on Russia. From the Thai perspective, it means they won't come here and won't spend money. And so, I think it's a very correct statement to say that the developing world will be impacted by all of this, and again, in ways that are very hard to predict. But in terms of the geopolitical implications, I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of this depends on what the final settlement is. So again, if you're optimistic like me, you believe that we're maybe a month or two away before we have a settlement of some sort of ceasefire and some sort of contours of what a final agreement will be. And as I was mentioning, I think that final agreement will involve a recognition of Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk as Russian territory, or at a very minimum, Russian controlled. But then, of course, the other key part is the guarantees around non-inclusion of NATO of Ukraine. But I think it's very important what that final agreement is, and I think it's very important the extent to which Russia feels satisfied by that, because what I'm concerned with is that I think whatever the end result is, the sort of public anger and shock around all of this is going to mean that the sanctions are probably not going to be relaxed anytime soon. In other words, I do not expect that there will be a ceasefire/agreement and the United States and EU and Europe and UK will remove the majority of the sanctions they've recently implemented. I think those are in for the long run. Now, given that, what worries me is you then think of the perspective of the Russian government, already almost sanctioned to the hilt, with in the worst case scenario, a NATO-Ukraine resolution that they're not entirely satisfied with. I almost wonder if that point, incentivize isn't the right word, but encourages them to act out in other areas. And this goes back to one of the first comments we had around, well, aren't they going to then extend their proxy actions, in Syria or cybersecurity or whatever? And I think the answer is absolutely. And I worry that depending on how this is ultimately resolved, they may simply retreat with the idea that they will get their revenge through these other means. And I think that's quite worrying, because that then opens up, I think, a broad basket of possibilities. Now, I think the nuclear option, so to speak, would be actions against the Baltic countries, which are, of course, a part of NATO. But there's Finland, not a part of NATO. There's Syria, there's Turkey, there's the Black Sea, there's so many options that these very creative and very smart and sneaky Russians could come up with, that I worry a little bit that almost an animal that is sort of got their backs to the wall and feels wounded and feels wronged, quite frankly, at the end of this, may act out. And that in some ways is my biggest concern. I think your point around China is in some ways the biggest question. In other words, where do they really sit in all of this? And of course, I don't know, but I do think, again, going back to this idea that I think it has been surprising to see the degree to which the world has reacted strongly and unitedly against Russia, for the most part, against this. And I think that China must look at this and say, well, any idea around NATO being fractured or Western opinion being fractured or the United States being fractured, I mean, there of course are dissident views around whether Russia is right or wrong, but they must look at this and say, at least at this moment, that's not really the prevailing message here, right? The prevailing message is we've got a united bloc that will oppose us if we were to do something aggressive. And in some ways, well, not perversely, but in some ways that may be a positive. That may be a positive message through all of this sort of fog. That may be a positive message to China to say, actually, there is a counter bloc here that will react forcefully to things like this. But ultimately, in terms of how does China view Russia post this situation, they must view Russia as having been not overly successful. And again, it's this kind of million-dollar question around, does China want a strong or a weak Russia? China and Russia, of course, are not the closest of allies. Someone could fact check me on this, but I believe China never recognized Crimea as Russian territory. I don't think Russia recognizes some of the claims around the South China Sea. So, this goes back, of course, decades into the communist.
And they're jockeying for power in Central Asia. They have a long boundary. Absolutely. Russia, of course, fears China taking some of Russian territory. And of course, there are scenarios lots of people are drawing out. All the intelligence agencies are drawing out various scenarios, that are drawing out. And I'm sure the Chinese are drawing out. I mean, they range from Putin is toppled, regime change, Ukraine wins on the battlefield, unlikely, peace is negotiated, Russia wins, then the insurgency follows, Russia wins after escalating with chemical or tactical nuclear weapons, and of course, NATO drawn into direct nuclear conflict. These are just some of the scenarios. I mean, I haven't gone through an exhaustive list, but the Chinese are obviously looking at them, and the Russians are wondering what the Chinese are thinking. So it is all a game of multi-dimensional chess.
It is, and in some ways, not to overanalyze or make this too academic, but in some ways, anytime you have a massive movement of the chess pieces on the world stage, like we are having here, it's an opportunity to analyze. And so, for example, we're seeing what's the Russian military actually like? What's Russia's strategic move here? What's the West doing? But the people on the side in all of this are China. So in some ways, the most analytical, the most profitable from an analysis perspective are sort of the Chinese, because they're the ones sitting on the side more or less looking at the reactions of everyone. Because it's not often that the West and Russia engage each other at all. And so, and when they do, I think you start to learn a lot, and you start to be able to get a little bit more data to draw your conclusions about the next engagement. And so in some ways, I think this is a little bit of a gold mine, a little bit of an analytic/intelligence gold mine for China, because they're starting to see a little bit more about the capabilities of the Russian army, about the strategic aims of Russia. They're starting to see a little bit more about the unity of the West, the will of the West. And so, but I do think the conclusion probably to the Chinese is that the West is quite resolute in how they've reacted here. Ultimately, again, I kind of go back to, if you think about, there was a written question that someone had posed around sort of, well, wasn't the West sort of in part at fault about all of this, because Russia had sort of signaled this complaint for quite some time and the West never did anything about it. and I, as I wrote, I completely agree with that. I think in some ways this Ukrainian conflict had been flagged by Russia as an issue for almost 2 to 3 decades, almost since the fall of the Soviet Union, saying, look, we're not comfortable entirely with this state as being the only buffer between us, and you keep flirting with Ukraine too much that we're not really comfortable. But if we remember, there was the very significant incident in Georgia I can't remember, 14 or 15, right? Northern Ossetia. Russia has done this with other countries. There was a revolution in Kyrgyzstan. There were street protests in Kazakhstan about 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So the region is not particularly stable. There are large Russian contingents scattered throughout, and I worry that again, a wounded Russia could look at any number of options for mischief here. And I think, again, if you look at a country that may be experiencing significant economic decay or decline for the next several years, and a leader that's looking for ways to bolster their popularity and their hold on power, you have to wonder, and I think be slightly nervous about additional military actions in other countries. Now, where those would be and in what context, I think is extremely difficult to predict. But my recommendation for the West, I think ultimately would be to try to resolve this Ukrainian situation in as conciliatory way as possible, if only not to prevent the next Russian outreach here. I worry that Russia does feel embarrassed in some ways overall.
So Joe, going back to this issue of Russian resentment, Glenn and I wrote a major article on making sense of Vladimir Putin's long game, and this we published on 24th of December. So those of you who want to read it, I can send the link out later in an email. But the important thing is that Russia does feel that it was stabbed in the back in the 1990s. And of course, they blame Jeffrey Sachs and his shock therapy. In some ways, and I've spoken about this issue to many people in the audience separately, in many ways, what American economists imposed, and it was the Harvard boys, and there was a headline a while ago, the Harvard boys do Russia, written by a fantastic American journalist. And she did have a point, because what the Harvard boys did was impose privatization, which led to kleptocracy, which led to the collapse of the economy, which led to old people, especially those from the middle classes, losing out their pensions in days, if not hours, in days, if not weeks, and sometimes hours too. It was ghastly. And that paved the way for Putin. It was almost like Russia's Versailles moment, at the moment of triumph, when Americans could have acted a bit more wisely and had some sort of a Marshall Plan. Instead, they opted for shock therapy. And we are living through the consequences of that. And if I understand it correctly, you're saying that another shock therapy might lead to an even greater resentment and an even crazier figure than Vladimir Putin taking power in Russia. And then we might be in for greater trouble. And Putin has already called this overnight loss of territory and the Russians remaining left behind in Kazakhstan and all the neighboring states as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Perhaps, one school is that, okay, we address Russian concerns, but then there is another school, which I hear again and again from people who are ex-CIA or people who are in MI6, that if Putin is appeased, he will do the same thing, or if Russians are appeased, they will do the same thing as Sudetenland. And the time has come for the West to stand up to Russia and to break its back. And so, of course, I'd love to hear your concluding comments on that. And of course, what Anna Pirnia has talked about, a new security model that Zelensky has called for. In my view on that is that a new security model is simply impossible, because no one right now has the moral legitimacy to ask for it. And different states are not going to buy into it, particularly all the emerging economies around the world that are suffering and are facing food shortages and energy shortages. But I'll leave you to have the last word.
I think it's undeniable that what Putin and the Russian government have done in Ukraine is barbaric. It has been something that the West correctly reacted as forcefully as they did to. But I think from a Russian, I think the real question is who will pick up the pieces of the society that Putin leaves? And it's easy to be sanctimonious in the West and say that the Russian society needs to overthrow Putin and needs to find a new leader, or that the Russian society needs to be the catalyst of change. But I think history has shown enough times that it can happen to any country, that nationalism and isolation and economic ruin feed into an environment where things go off the rails. And so, although I think the West is correct to punish the government for the Russian government for what it's done, I think the difficult path forward, as it has been many times throughout history, will be to try to balance that punishment with also trying to find a path forward that doesn't leave the country in a position where 5, 10, 15 years down the road, it's worse off than it is now. You're already seeing, the very last thing I'll say, just talking to friends and just seeing social media posts, you're seeing a lot of manifestations of Russian nationalism among educated and middle class and quote unquote normal people. They've taken, Netflix has been cut off. They've taken the N, inverted it to the Z from the tanks and calling it Zetflix and pirating it, right? I mean, they're a creative, smart country who when pushed can find ways to survive on their own. And so I think the challenge for the West and the obligation of the West is to find the way forward that appropriately stands up to Putin and lets him know that this behavior is not going to stand and it's not appropriate, but also doesn't overly punish the country and the society as a whole to the point where we isolate Russia to a position where the society then breaks down and then looks for a leader even worse than him. So that's my hope, and I think that's a very challenging policy imperative for the West, and I hope it's one that we can meet.
Well, on that positive, optimistic note, thank you all very much for joining us for this episode or this issue of Fair Observer Exclusive. We hope to see you next month. Please share the link with your friends. Please do bring them along. We don't advertise this and we only send invitations through word of mouth. On that note, all the very best for the next month ahead, and thank you all for attending. We'll keep making sense of the world for you, and it's bye for now.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.